Mic back? Yes. Hello, everyone. I can't hear you, but you can hear me. That's good. So, today, let's put my headphones on. Not that it really matters, not chatting with anyone. We'll talk about network design. Now we'll do headphones. So this is the network I have now, and I want to do some redesigning of it. So I'm going to go over kind of what I have and what I've been playing with and what I might try to use. So if you guys have any ideas, feel free to let me know in the chat. I would love to hear about them. So I have internet. Stop moving things around. Internet. I have OpenSense. As you know, I'm a big fan of OpenSense, so I use that for lots and lots of things. It has just a couple things it can't do that bother me, but not much. We'll get to that. I want to redesign it. So I have the big switch, MikroTik CRS328, which if you saw my video would be there. And to the CRS328, basically everything is connected, and everything is in basically one subnet. So the 172.27.0/20 and the FD9755DA 5181:1/64. So some segmentation would be nice. Not necessarily because, I mean, these are relatively large subnets. That's not necessarily a problem. But I've been adding so much stuff recently that it's been hard to keep some of the VLANs straight. Especially because currently everything is just allow all VLANs. And I would like to do some more organization so the CRS328 is locking down the VLANs more. I know the /20 is huge. I basically assign everything on a increment of 10. So like the Proxmox server is /50. The TrueNAS server is /30. The cluster is at like 151, 152, 153. It goes from there. The Eve server is at 70. And whatever I'm testing usually just gets DHCP assigned. And I don't have a /8. So I tried to pick a number that was not going to be common. I mean, anytime you're using a RFC 1918 subnet, there's always a chance that you're going to have a collision if you do VPN. So like if I'm out and about and I VPN home, then if my subnet at home matches with the subnet I'm on locally, then I won't be able to route. So like if I use 10/8, then when I go anywhere, but sense radius, I'll get to that. So if you use like a /8, even if it's not full at all and you're not having broadcast issues, because like a /20 is large, but that doesn't mean that I have thousands of devices, so I don't necessarily have a broadcast storm issue because it's not full, it's just large. And I like it that way because I like having DHCP addresses not get reused basically ever and things like that. But if you're somewhere out and about and you're connecting to their network and then VPNing through their network and they're using the same subnet as you won't be able to route to two places at once. So that's part of the reason why in IPv6, unique local addresses are supposed to be unique even though they're local. So like I have FD9755DA 5181, and I generated that with a random number generator. So the FD prefix means unique local, and then you get 40 bits of random plus 16 bits to identify your subnet plus 64 bits for the subnet. So now on the IPv6 side, as long as you truly do use unique local addresses, it's not a problem. If you use ULAs, if you have a global prefix, that's also guaranteed to be unique, so that's fine. It's just when you're using the IPv4 RFC 1918 subnets that you have problems. And I haven't had that issue with 172.27. In the wild, you tend to see a lot of 192.168.1s, and then you see some people that are clever and they do .2. You see a lot of 172.16s, and you see a lot of 10.0.0s. So going to something with some random numbers in the range, upper bits of the range, is good for that. So 172.27, it's got some randomness up there. I could have used a different lower digit here instead of 0, so on a /20, my next one would have been a 9, an 8. Hello from Vienna and Germany and everyone else. So that's part of the reason why the redesign. But the other redesign is because I have too many dang switches off of everything. Yeah, so 100/64 is... I use that internally, 100/64. You're not supposed to use 100/64 because it's reserved for carrier grade NAT. And a lot of people, at least where I am, are either behind carrier grade NAT or at least on carrier grade NAT on wireless, so like LTE. So I have a network set up with carrier grade NAT, and it's not on the diagram, but I actually use the carrier grade NAT address for testing routers. So I have a subnet off of OpenSense on a VLAN, and it's set up with 100/64 and a 2001 DB8, which is the documentation prefix. And then I can test different router OSs with that as the WAN side, and then use a second VLAN as the LAN side. And so I've done that with Vios. I did that with OpenWRT a little bit. I didn't really go into that one too far. I've done nested OpenSense, things like that. So keep 100/64 for carrier grade stuff. Yeah, so anyway, another one of the reasons to redo things is to get more stuff on the FD97 prefix. Because the more stuff I have on IPv6, the less problems I will have with routing if I'm going over a VPN connection. Because if I only route the ULA over the VPN connection, then there's no way there could be a conflict. Because the VPN tunnel is just IPv6. There's no reason for it to be IPv4 in general. Yeah, I have a bunch of stuff here. So some stuff I want, I guess I'll make a new save as of this. And start writing down some things I would like to do differently. So I don't have an IoT VLAN. And in general, I don't have a ton of stuff that would need it. Most of my IoT stuff is on like Zigbee and Z-Wave because I hate Wi-Fi, but there's some stuff that's not. But the other option here is to use PPSK. So like if MikroTik supports it, and OpenWRT I think does as well. I come out here. PPSK. New router OS. You have a page on it. Wireless. Yeah, so basically what you can do with PPSK is, so with a traditional IoT VLAN and a separate Wi-Fi SSID, you have your access points broadcast two different SSIDs, and they have two different passwords. And then clients that connect to those different SSIDs get assigned the different VLANs, and they get routed. And that's all good and fine. But with PPSK, you have one SSID and more than one key. And so what happens is when the client connects to the access point, it gives its MAC address. And so the access point then goes and looks up in a database what the key should be for that MAC address, and then proceeds to do the PSK authentication, the pre-shared key, assuming that the client is using the correct PSK. And that way, if it's using the incorrect PSK, it'll fail. The downside of that is that you can't just tell everyone, here's your PSK. You have to first enroll them with their MAC address. So for IoT devices, that's fine. I can just bump them over to the IoT network once they connect once to the original network. or I have to connect them to like a test network or something to grab their MAC address. So for devices that don't change often, that's fine. The other thing you can do is you can have open authentication and then bump them to a VLAN by that. And if you're using WPA3, you can still get encryption for that, which would be nice. Disable random MAC addresses. I don't usually do that. I have a lot of devices I randomly connect to Wi-Fi, and I'm not super concerned about it. I mean, it's the difference between doing a home lab network and a business network. So what other questions came up that I didn't answer yet? OpenSense radius. Yes, so radius would be something that would do the PPSK. So the access point would reach out over radius. There'd be some extra fields in radius that get returned. Some access points can take a VLAN field, so based on the client's MAC address, it'll put them in a different VLAN, even though they're on the same SSID. Some access points can also take a different PPSK, or private PSK. And that's without using WPA EAP encryption, too. So that's an idea of something I want to play with. So I have up here unused hardware. This is hardware that I own that I'm not using. So I can move this guy over here and use him to test PPSK and decide if I want to get new access points or reflash all mine with OpenWRT or something. VPN home routing. It depends. So the big problem is if you're routing networks and the two networks at both sides are the same range, then they won't be able to route. And that applies no matter what overhead you're using to route. So if your home network is 192.168.1 and you're at a remote location that's also 192.168.1, then it won't know which route to take, and it will take the incorrect route. Because you have to keep that route enabled for the VPN to be able to connect. So you can't just disable the route locally. So what I do currently, so another question that came up, do you tend to disable access to the public internet? And currently what I do is I do that on a basically on a per MAC basis. So even though they're all on the same subnet here, they can all talk to each other. There's nothing preventing them from talking to each other. OpenSense does have a MAC address block list of devices that are not allowed to access the internet. And those get blocked here from going out to the internet. And I also have a rule that redirects DNS traffic going out to my local DNS server so that they're not going to circumvent that by trying to go out to like Google DNS or something. So that's how I currently do segmentation. So the segmentation I have is entirely here at the firewall. So all of this networking down here, everyone can talk to each other here, but they can't talk up to the internet. And in general, I'm happy with that. It hasn't made me angry. I guess more of the things that I want to redesign are like all the stacked switches and stuff. You'll have reading comments. Yes, I understand that keeping it simple is good. That's why I didn't go more than one subnet initially. And I'm still not sure if I actually do want to go more than one subnet in general. The biggest thing I want to do is get my layer 2 in order and probably promote the MikroTik switch from a layer 2 to a layer 3. There's a graphic here that's layer 3. So I'm currently running Switch OS on the MikroTik. I think I want to move that to a router OS and then do more configuration there on the MikroTik. And probably also move the FD97 prefix to the MikroTik. So the OpenSense has the public prefix and also the FD97 prefix, and it gives both of those out. And in IPv6, there's nothing stopping you from having a bunch of IP addresses at the same time. So I could put the FD97 prefix on the MikroTik running as a router. Yes, hardware offloading for routes. So the CRS 328 with RouterOS 7, it should be able to hardware offload routes in IPv4 and IPv6, but not stateful firewall rules. So it can only offload stateless firewall rules, which are ACLs. So normal firewall rules that you're used to in like OpenSense, if you have an outgoing connection, it'll automatically basically add a new rule to allow packets for that already matched connection to come back. And on the CRS 328 in layer 3, it can't do that. So I'd have to manually set up ACLs to allow traffic in both directions for return traffic, because it's strictly a deny list of traffic getting passed packet by packet on the CRS 328. And the CRS 328 is probably not going to be able to do like CPU-based routing. So that's why I was thinking of moving the FT97 prefix to the MikroTik, but leaving the 2000 global prefix in OpenSense. Yeah, so I get that. And so I guess it depends on where you need the stateful rules. So if I'm using FT97 for most things within the network, then I'm probably not going to be as concerned about routing rules, maybe. That was the thought, I guess. The OpenSense box also only has gigabit. It is not easier to remove. Yeah, so that's the conclusion I came up with before, was that moving stuff to a different VLAN wasn't necessarily the right move, because I can still block things at the firewall, as I always have. Yeah, so Fast Track can't offload on the CRS 328, from what I can tell. They have a page on it, and I'll pull that up. I think it's this page. Yeah, so this one. So we can offload, yeah, so don't support Fast Track and NAT, but they do support route and layer 3 ACL. And so the reason to move routing to the MikroTik instead of the OpenSense is that I could get 10 gig or higher routing speeds purely in hardware offload. Whereas the OpenSense box has MaxSec. Yeah. Whereas the OpenSense box has 1 gigabit to WAN and 1 gigabit to LAN. And then I have 2 other gigabits that I don't use. I guess I could bond them, but even then, it's probably not going to do 10 gig routing. Or like 2 gig routing. So keeping the OpenSense for external interfaces seems to make sense to me. 2 gig. I actually have some 2.5 gig stuff, and I've been getting a lot of it recently. So the little cluster got upgraded to 2.5 gig. And I got this little switch from MokerLink because when I looked about a month and a half ago, they were the cheapest one on Amazon. And prices have moved around since then. So I think they're still like second cheapest, but I literally wanted to make a video called like the cheapest 2.5 gig switch on Amazon, and the time it's taken me to make that, it's not the cheapest anymore. But it works just fine. It does not support jumbo frames, which is unfortunate, especially because I wanted to do VXLAN for my cluster. Yeah, so really what I want is like 2 networks, like the network of everything in the house and the network of everything in the lab. And if I just keep those 2 on their own, then I think I'd be pretty happy. Because like a lot of this stuff, I'm perfectly fine with the firewall rules. Like the cameras and the IoT sensors and stuff, they get blocked at the firewall. They don't try to do anything most of the time. So like a lot of my cameras are made by Cluster. Oh, the cluster, it's from my cluster is from my hyperconverged cluster video. And it's 3 sometimes more, yeah, Proxmox and Ceph. So that's the cluster. I was hoping to get higher Ceph bandwidth with 2.5 gig, And in reality, the problem is that the USB flash drives are just so darn slow that no amount of networking is going to fix that. But I still did 2.5 gig, and I got, I don't know, a video or two to come about that. So they have their own 2.5 gig switch purely to connect locally to each other. And then they're also connected to 1 gig on the LAN with separate addresses. Jumbo frames are overrated. I usually agree. The only case when I don't think they're overrated is when you're using tunneling protocols. So like if you do big clusters with Proxmox, you can use VXLAN to do, the Proxmox software-defined network manager can do VXLAN. And when you do VXLAN, you lose 50 bytes to protocol overhead. So if you can do baby jumbo frames that are 1550 bytes on the wire, then your encapsulated tunnel gets a layer 2 and layer 4. So every layer 2 packet gets added into a UDP frame, which has 50 bytes of overhead. And it basically works as like a switch over a routed network. So all the nodes in the cluster can join open or VXLAN segments. So going to a 1550 byte frame would mean that the encapsulated traffic in VXLAN still gets 1500. And that's the use case I wanted, and the Mocha Link won't do 1550. Let's see, so what other things am I considering? 40 gig. No 40 gig for me. I want to stop using my access point as my desk switch. So I'm looking for recommendations on a desk switch that can do dual 10 gig. Oh, nope, not that. So I have this fiber here that runs from there to the laundry room. And it wouldn't be that hard to run another fiber up to my desk. But, yeah, I do testing stuff at 2.5 gig on my desk sometimes. In the sneeze. Maybe not. Okay. Dual 10 gig. Probably SFP. So I have the fiber, and the fiber would obviously need an SFP. My desktop has an RJ45 card, but I also own a SFP Plus card, so I could change that out. That wouldn't be a big deal. Then I can run either Cat6 or fiber. Currently I'm running 5 gig to my desktop. And I have it in the diagram over here. So this is 5 gig. And that's because I have Cat5, and that was the highest I could get it to run at reliably. Not 5e, just 5. Wiring in the house is like 20 years old. It's all really well done, it's just 20 years old. I'm also pushing the distance limit of the SFP Plus transceiver because I'm using SFP Plus to RJ45 and those get really hot and have distance limits. So what I really like would be like dual 10 gig plus like 2.5 gig with PoE or something. Because that would cover like all the use cases I have. Because I often plug in like IoT stuff. If I'm working on like building a project, I'll often plug it in over, yeah, I could get a 305. Can I buy a 305 now? Let's see. So here is 305. It's out of stock. Who could have guessed? You get a 309. It's out of stock too. How about a, what's the next one up? 312, I think, is the RJ45 one. I could buy that one. That's one left, yeah. So no, probably not able to buy any CRS switches. Currently, what I use as my desktop switch is the access point. So next to my desk, I have an access point in the wall, and it's the EAP235 wall. And it has a built-in 4-port switch, so there's PoE in on the back. It's like mounted into the wall box. 610. Yeah, the 610 doesn't do router OS, which doesn't really bother me that much. I don't know. The CSS 610 is like almost the same price as like the CSS 326, which has a lot more ports. Yeah, so currently I have the EAP235 wall, which like mounts as a wall plate. So there's a jack in the back for PoE in, and then the bottom of it has 3 more jacks, and one of them does PoE out. And currently I intended on using that to hook up stuff on my desk, but I ended up getting a Quinn LED for my desk light that I wanted to do wired Ethernet because I don't like Wi-Fi whenever possible. And I also have a smart TV that I also don't like Wi-Fi whenever possible. So these guys are taking up all my ports on my access point. So I have one port for whatever I'm testing. And then for a while I actually had another 8-port switch, old 100 megabit switch, just because I was reformatting the cluster so often that I brought the cluster upstairs, set it next to my desk, and reformatted it over and over until I was happy with it. So this is how, okay. So other things I have are the Hex S, which I use for router OS testing, and the LTE modem. And so in theory, I didn't think this through very well, but in theory with the LTE modem, all I have to do on IPv6 side is have it advertise its prefix at a low priority. So clients should not prefer a low priority router over a high priority router for the same group. So I can have 2 routers advertising ULA prefixes, and they can both be the same, and then another router advertising a 2000 prefix at the same priority. And clients should pick the ULA prefix for other ULA prefixes or the 2000 prefix for the 2000 prefixes. And whatever router has the highest priority becomes the default route. So if I take the LTE modem and I literally just plug it into the switch, get in, I want you to go on the side, like that, then in theory this can just advertise another route on IPv6 in the 2000 range at low priority. So when this one fails, Comcast fails, then clients should just fall back to the address they already have on the low priority router. Or if the OpenSense box fails, or if any of that happens, they should fall back to this guy. The downside is I don't think Router OS does IPv6. I have to look at it more to do IPv6 with a SLAAC prefix, because on LTE you get the prefix assigned to the modem, and the modem is then assigning prefixes via SLAAC, and it's not doing DHCP prefix delegation. So that would be the goal here. On the IPv4 side, it's a bit harder. Thankfully, a lot of these IoT devices are dumb, and they don't try to connect to, or the ones that are phoning home a lot tend to not be phoning home on IPv6. So like of my security cameras, all of my Dahua security cameras don't phone home at all. They have not tried anything. I got 2 like complete no-name brand ones that I use to monitor my 3D printer, and they were like $40 on AliExpress, and they try to phone home. But they just have like, they seem to just have like hard-coded IP addresses, because they're not doing DNS, they're just going out. Yeah, so I got that same feeling about IPv6 being fully supported, but that still doesn't mean that it will work correctly with a SLAAC prefix. So I did testing with the hex, and I can get a prefix via DHCP prefix delegation, which is how Comcast and most ISPs do it, like normal ISPs. The problem I seem to be having is that the LTE modem does not give me a prefix via prefix delegation. The modem is taking the IPv6 address from the carrier, and then on the Ethernet interface, it's providing to Router OS the IPv6 via SLAAC. So it wasn't going to pick that up and redistribute it. I would have to bridge the modem. Yes, that is true. So I need to implement firewall rules both here and here, at least on IPv6. And that would mean that moving to Router OS instead of OpenSense would make that a lot easier, because I could copy and paste the rules. And if I copy and paste the rules, then then they will be the same. So, but that's a way to do backup without having to have OpenSense do the backup, which means instead of just handling Comcast failures, I'm handling failures of both. The downside, though, is that usually the failures on my end are Comcast and not OPNsense. So OPNsense, unless the interface goes down, it doesn't stop advertising its route. So like it has a route from Comcast that it says should be valid for an hour. It advertises it to clients. Then Comcast stops routing, but OPNsense doesn't know that. Seems to be the problem. Because it never, like, the interface itself doesn't go down. It's still physically connected to the modem. So it doesn't see an interface down. It just sees that routing is getting a bunch of errors. So then we have IPv4. And I have been playing around with IPv6 only. So if I flip over to Eve, so I've been using EVE-NG to simulate a network that only has IPv6. And that network is called Cloud9, and it's called Cloud9 because it's VLAN tag number 9 on my network. And so Cloud9 has its own SSID and its own VLAN tag. And I've been periodically connecting my laptop and my cell phone to Cloud9, which only has traffic via IPv6. And so far, it has honestly worked way better than I thought it would. Way better. I was expecting everything on the internet to be broken. And first day, everything on the internet pretty much was broken. Reddit doesn't do IPv6 yet, which is dumb. Google was just fine. Google was perfectly fine. As expected. But then I introduced NAT64. Oh, I didn't actually want to look at you. I just wanted to show you. Switches and APs. So I don't know of anything missing on Ubiquiti access points. On the switch side, I don't think they really do layer 3 yet, which doesn't matter for most people, except for my core switch, CRS328. The other thing, though, to me, is that they require a web GUI that they don't run themselves. So all of the TP-Link hardware has a web GUI local to the device if you don't adopt it into the controller. And with UniFi, you're really locked in to be in that ecosystem because you have to have a controller. I mean, you have to have the controller running all the time. You have to set up a controller just to set up the switch. Like, there's no way to locally control the switch if you just have one of them. If you have a lot of them, that's probably fine, but if I only buy one switch for my desk, I don't want to have to set up a controller just for that one switch if I'm not all UniFi. And I'm definitely not going to be UniFi on the routing side. Opens for them. RB, what's the 951G? Yeah, so another controller doesn't have to be running all the time. I still have to set it up. And that's still like a pain. Just to configure the switch. Whereas all of these guys, either they don't have any configuration at all, or they have a web interface. And I can log into the web interface and configure them. And it's pretty easy. So unless I want to go with a full UniFi network and buy all new equipment, it's not a fantastic option for me. Yeah, I don't have an intention of having faster than one gig on the Comcast side. People just feel like they need way faster internet than they do. It would be much more helpful to me to not have a data cap, 1.2 terabyte data cap, than to have more than like the 400 megs I currently have. Yes, I agree. UniFi switches are expensive. The MikroTik feature switches have a ton of features. And they, at least when I bought mine, they were very reasonable. So like the CRS328 that I got was like $100 less than UniFi equivalent. And the UniFi equivalent with PoE didn't have 10 gig. You had to go to like an $800 switch to get 10 gig uplinks. And I use my 10 gig uplink ports as like a 10 gig switch. So I have four 10 gig ports on the MikroTik, and I run one to my workstation, one to TrueNAS, and fiber to the laundry room, which is actually just 1 gig, but it's still SFP. Which one is the RB915G? Yeah, you probably don't pay like $100 a month either for 400 megs down. RB 915. G. Ah, this little thing. And it's in stock. Yeah, this looks like the wireless version of the Hex, which I have. Actually, what can the Hex do? Could get an RB4 5009. Yeah, so I think I have 20 megs up, and going to gigabit Comcast, I would get like 35 megs up. And I know that I do upload a lot of YouTube videos, and that might help me, but usually I just let them upload, and they take time, and that's fine with me. How much is a RB5009? Non-PoE version. $200. That's less than I spent on my Protectly box for... It's like $100 less than I spent on the Protectly box. Yeah, 50 euros a month. Yeah, that's... We pay like 3 times that here. Well, for I guess that'd be for gigabit. I pay, it's like 120 a month, I think. Yes. 29 euros, damn. And I get 20 megs up. This is ridiculous. So I have a Hex S. And what does it say the Hex S can do? I bought the Hex S because I wanted to do testing. Test results. Routing. 2 gig down to nothing. Okay. Yeah, so actually the data caps aren't super influential to me. Let's see. Not you. You. No, 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 no. Yeah, so it looks like in the last month. Yeah, so we're not actually going over the data cap. Oh yeah, Baltic Networks. That's where I get my MikroTik stuff from. It's pretty much all I buy from them, but that's where I get MikroTik stuff. Yeah, so it looks like in the last month I've used my house's the Comcast connection in aggregate is using 909 gigs. So the 1.2 terabyte data cap isn't a big deal yet. But like if I look at this, like there's been one time when I've gone over. So this graph shows average, not peak. But if I go to like the last 7 days, see a little bit of vacation. Like we're not going over 20 megabits hardly ever. If I go into the last 1 day, yeah. So here's me live streaming right now, and it's at like 6 megabits. If I go back to yesterday, I think I uploaded a video yesterday. Maybe it wasn't yesterday. Probably this here. Yeah, so that's me uploading a video. Looks like it was capped at around 25 megabits. Me uploading to YouTube. So you'll see that video in a few days, probably. Yeah, so like I'm not needing more bandwidth. I'm like, people are buying the wrong things. Yeah, I don't want to get a new router again, or a new modem again. I've had enough hard time on the phone with Comcast. Just want to avoid that entirely and just stick with what I have, at least on the Comcast side. Every dealing with them is terrible. There's a reason that there's a South Park episode basically entirely about them. Symmetric gigabit fiber. That's quite a bit. I don't have anywhere near that. Yeah, I don't know who's doing frequent large downloads. Like, even when I update games, like Steam can update games overnight, and the fact that it takes 2 hours doesn't bother me. The change was awful. Yes, you got rid of the data cap, but you had to call Comcast. Was it worth it? So I get, from Comcast, I get a /32. I get a single IPv4 address that is effectively static because it has not changed in 2 years. It appears to be tied to the MAC address of the router, because the last time I upgraded my router, I got a new IPv4 address on a completely different subnet. But it's effectively been static for me since then. So I've had the same v6 prefix for 2 years, and I've had the same v4 address for 2 years. So I don't have like static IPs, but I don't really feel the need to buy any of them. I don't have CGNAT behind Comcast, which is nice. Although if more of the world would go to IPv6, I honestly wouldn't mind. Yeah. Talking about networking. So currently I have the EVE-NG set up that I was talking about before with Cloud9 and the NAT64 bridge. And actually the path that data takes is kind of not entirely shown in this diagram. Yeah, so from my perspective, it doesn't make sense for internet service providers to be handing out IPv4s to customers anymore. They should be doing CGNAT for everyone. But the only downside to that is, I mean, like, if you get a CGNAT IPv4 and a public IPv6 prefix, you should be fine. But so many of these hotspot places, like, I have a school I work with, I mentor robotics. Their entire network is a flat /16. I am not joking. And, well, actually, no, they have two flat /16s. They have one. So I don't know why CGNAT is so unpopular. I know that people don't like CGNAT because they're so unhappy they don't get a public IP. But if they embraced IPv6, it wouldn't be a problem for anyone. So I have this school I work with, and they have two flat /16s. It's like 10.0/16 and 172.16/16. And it's like their internal network and their public network. And both of them don't do IPv6 at all. And they block everything except port 80 and 443 on the firewall if you're on the public network. So like in order for me to VPN in, I have to use TCP 443 from home, or like from there to home. I have to use TCP 443 and I have to use IPv4 because they don't support IPv6 on their end. So like for me, running my VPN IPv6 only and having a CGNAT public IP isn't a big deal at all. I'd be perfectly fine setting that up. But there's just so many places I go that like the network admins are dumb and they just disable IPv6 because they're scared of it. And I wouldn't be able to connect home because I don't have an IPv4, which is frustrating. So this is other things I've been testing. So this is EVE-NG. Someday I might make a video about it. I made a video about it before. Deutsche Telekom. Oh, I see. So the problem is you don't get a static v6 either. So I don't get a static v6, but it's effectively static. So like I do DHCP v6 prefix delegation, and they give me a prefix, and they only give me a /60 because their Comcast is dumb. But I get a /60, so I can do 8 subnets. And it's technically dynamic, but it's never changed. So I don't see a problem with that. I know it doesn't bother me because it hasn't changed. It's effectively a static v6 to me. One thing I did find out too is, so you have Deutsche Telekom, we have Deutsche Telekom in the US, and we call them T-Mobile. And my 24-hour refresh. Yeah, so mine, I get a /60 dynamic, but it never refreshes. I mean, it has a 24-hour lifetime, but I always get the same one back every time. So it's effectively been static for like 2 years. I did notice, so if I go back to this guy, so I have the LTE backup, and I have a subscription, a really low data subscription to it for testing with T-Mobile, and they give me a /64 IPv6 that changes every time I connect to a new tower. So however they're routing it, or I guess not a new tower, but every time I reboot the modem. So every time the modem powers up, it connects to the cell network, it gets assigned a v6 prefix. And rebooting the modem will get a new prefix. And I guess that makes sense to me because that's LTE, and they're probably dealing with hundreds of millions of subscribers. Not that they should be running out of v6 prefixes, but that they don't have a way of keeping them static, I guess makes sense to me. And that's fine. Getting a 64 routable 64 makes sense. And I even tested it, and inbound works just fine. So like I hosted a server on my dynamic LTE IPv6, and I could connect to it from the internet, no problem. As long as I just typed in all the addresses, typed in the address. Yeah, so I get a 64, and with a 64, you can still do hotspot without NAT. You just can't do more than one subnet. So a 64 is the smallest size a subnet can realistically be in IPv6. So if you get a 64 from T-Mobile, in my case, then I can still advertise this to clients. I just can't advertise it on more than one subnet. And then on Comcast, I get a 60, so I can do 8 subnets. And I don't know why they don't give me a 56, because but at least they give me that. So the question I guess I have with this is, it's interesting you get IPv4 only, because most mobile networks don't do IPv6 internally or externally. So like T-Mobile does IPv6, all IPv6 on their network, and then the IPv4 is done with a technique called 464 XLAT. Try to pull up a diagram of that. Or 64 XLAT. So this is how like every mobile operator in the US works. Yeah. So in the public internet, they have CGNAT. And then in their internal network, they have IPv6 all the way out to the mobile radio. And then there's a software called the CLAT, which translates IPv4 addresses into translated IPv6 addresses. So they take a /96 IPv6 prefix, and they add the entire 32-bit IPv4 address on the end of it, and it becomes an IPv6 address that gets routed to the PLAT, and the PLAT does both carrier-grade NAT and translating back from IPv6 and IPv4. And I think all 3 major networks in the US do this, and they rely on the phone as the CLAT. So the tower and the core network, the LTE core network, is not doing anything involving IPv4 at all. It goes all the way back to the edge where they're doing CGNAT, and that's where they're converting it back from IPv6. So in my case, with the MikroTik device, which I have, that does the LTE, I pull that up, it is doing so I have the older version of this. And I got this because they were out of stock on the ones that didn't have. I have this, I think. Maybe this one? LTE6 kit. I have one of these guys. But I'll pick this one. But this has a modem built in on a PCIe card, and the modem is what's doing the CLAT side. So by the time it gets to router OS, it's not just IPv6 anymore. It's been split back out into IPv4 and IPv6. And so if I look at my phone, it'll tell me. Yeah, so cheap cloud servers are an option for IPv6. Funnily enough, one of the advantages of using IPv6 on your home network is you can use cheaper cloud servers because some cloud providers charge you less if you don't need an IPv4 address. So T-Mobile in Germany, different APNs. So T-Mobile in the US only offers 464 XLAT. At least for like non-business customers. I don't know what they offer to business customers. I'm not one of those. I'm sure for people that are paying a lot for static v4, they'll get something different. But it's also possible that their CGN dual stack is doing 464 XLAT still. Because like in my case, the modem was doing it, and normal phones will do it too. So here's 464 XLAT. So this is what I've been doing. I've been using Joule to do NAT64 in my test network. And it has been great. They don't have a good diagram here. So basically what happens is I have the test network Cloud9, and if I connect to that Wi-Fi, I get on VLAN 9, and VLAN 9 has IPv6 for everything, and no IPv4 at all. So the clients then do their IPv6 DNS lookups to OpenSense. OpenSense is then configured to do NAT or DNS64. So every time a DNS reply comes that doesn't have a quad A record, it will synthesize one. So it'll take the address, which is something like, I don't know. It's a good one. And it'll turn it into, like, was it B? I don't remember the prefix. 64FF9B. So it turns it like this. So if the client does a DNS request and the site has a quad A record, it returns that. Client does IPv6, all is good. If the site does not have a quad A record but does have an A record, then it takes the A record and adds it on the end of this prefix, 64FF9B. And then the last 32 bytes are the IPv6 address. And then I just have to tell OpenSense where to route 64FF9B. And in my case, oops, nope, get out of there. And I'm going to NAT64, which is running an EVE-NG, the hypervisor, which I really want to reformat, but I can't because I've based my whole experiment on running this on the very experimental hypervisor. So then what Joule does on NAT64 is it basically translates this address back into the 6.6.6.6 and then does carrier grade NAT on it. So it is taking the IPv6 address that it's been given, translating that to IPv4, and then NATing it. So the client connects to 64FF9B 6.6.6.6, and the NAT64 server here is doing both NAT and IPv6 to v4 translation. So in theory, if I could put this on OpenSense, then my internal network could be all IPv6, just using the 64FF9B, the FD97, and the 2000 prefixes that I have. And I wouldn't have to deal with dual stacking anything internally, which means that every time I make firewall rule changes or whatever, I don't have to make 2 copies of all of them, which would be very nice, because it's kind of a pain to make 2 copies of all of them sometimes. Some of them are Mac-based, and Mac-based rules don't need protocol-specific copies, but yeah. Another neat advantage I found is that this works, because you're encapsulating the entire IP address, this works for local clients too. So like if I pull up view, so I can go to like 64 FB, FF9B, so this should be a Proxmox server, I think. You're FF9B, right? Yeah, you're FF9B. What did I do wrong? Oh, do you get rebooted or something? So the IPv4, IPv6, and DNS. What happens is most sites already have both, and so there's 2 different types of records for. How about a different one of these? You should work. You're not going to be HTTPS. Why are you not working? I shut down the translator? It's a sad day. But anyway, in theory, it works for internal services too. So if you have some internal server that's ancient that doesn't support IPv6, the NAT64 still works for it. Yeah, so on a, let me pull up anything that has, not you, how about you? Yeah, so like if I NS lookup them, so I did an NS lookup at google.com, and it gave me back 2 answers. And so one of them is an A record, so it's an IPv4. The other one's a quad A record, which is IPv6. So then the client can say, do I want to use IPv4 or do I want to use IPv6? And a lot of times it'll try both and see which one responds first, and then keep using that server for the rest of the session. But if it doesn't have an IPv4 address, then it can't go that way, so it's going to go IPv6 for sure. Sometimes you get other things that don't work, so like Reddit. That was an example I found. So this does have IPv6, but www does not. So their CDN doesn't. And so see what's happened here is I have asked it to go to www.reddit.com, and it got back only A records, which are IPv4. So what OpenSense did, or Unbound did, running on OpenSense, is it translated all of those into their IPv6 equivalents, so 64 FF9B, and then it added the entire IPv4 address on the end. So that's DNS64. That means the DNS server is returning an IPv6 address that points to the IPv4 server. And because IPv6 addresses are so massive, we can encapsulate the entire IPv4 address in just a small chunk of the IPv6 address. And then let the NAT64 server, which is taking all routes to 64 FF9B, and it'll untranslate this back into the IPv4 address and initiate the connection on IPv4. And there are servers publicly that do this, but I think there are. But I'm running it with Joule, which so far has worked great. Okay, are we back? I'm back. Hello. Yes, IPv6 design. LTE failback is great, but power failback is great too. Let me find where my diagram went. Yeah, you. Yeah. So, yeah, hello again. So I have a UPS for my servers in the basement. I don't have one for my desktop. My desktop uses way too much power to get a UPS that big. Maybe I could get a UPS for my desktop. I don't know. I have one. All my servers have a UPS. I don't have one for my desktop that I'm streaming from. That's the problem. So the power flickered. All the servers were fine. All the infrastructure was fine, but the workstation was not. I rebooted and yeah, I probably should get a bigger power supply for my workstation too. I only have an 850 watt power supply, and back in the day, it seemed like graphics cards peaked out at like 200 watts, and now things be dumb. The power doesn't go out often. It was more like a flicker. Like it was off for a couple seconds and it came back on. It was long enough that all the lights turned off and they all turned back on again. And it happens all the time, pretty much. I don't know, not weekly, maybe like I don't know, twice a month or something. Like the voltage goes completely to zero, everything turns off, and then it comes back on. It's pretty much like wind related, my area. You know, our power company's kind of shit. Way better than Comcast. Anything's better than Comcast. But actually, Comcast has been pretty reliable for me in the past couple years. They used to have a lot of problems, but they're at least functional now all the time. Okay, so I'm back, and glad all of you are still here. We were talking about NAT64. Yeah. I understand that. Getting a UPS causes more problems. UPS gets angry and turns off and all that stuff. I do have a UPS, and let's see what the uptime of my switch is. Oops, not Discord. This. Yeah, so somewhere here it'll find a switch. Yeah, so it's this is my switch, and with the UPS it has an uptime of almost 450 days now. So that's the CRS 328 that I would be moving from SwitchOS to RouterOS. That's quite a long uptime. And then all the internet infrastructure is pretty much all PoE powered. That's one of the big challenges with having this switch, the CRS 328. Because it's my only PoE switch, I have a bunch of stuff on it that's low speed, but PoE. And I also have a bunch of stuff on it that's high speed and not PoE. And I really wish I had separate switches for those two things. Because, like, Proxmox, that server probably couldn't go 10 gig. It doesn't have any PCIe slots. TrueNAS is 10 gig. Eve could do 10 gig. Whatever I'm testing could do 10 gig. Workstation could do 10 gig. Cluster maybe could do 10 gig. I don't know. Security cameras, though, like, they're 100 meg and they're on my core switch because they need PoE, and my core switch is also my PoE switch. So maybe what I need is to get like a CRS 309, I think, is the 10 gig switch. Baltic Networks. Could get RB 4000 or 5009. Load shipping. Or CRS 309. Yeah, you. If only you weren't out of stock. I can do 10 gig on that. Options. Yeah, so that was NAT64. We were talking about NAT64 when the power went out. Any other comments on NAT64? It's a topic, like IPv6 is a topic that I like a lot. I feel like way too many network admins are just being like, let's just disable IPv6 because it's scary or whatever. And that's just not the way to go for anyone. So I've been dual stack at home for a very long time, and that's been great. At least giving all the clients a public IP. Or yeah, public IPv4 and IPv6. but moving my internal stuff to IPv6 is something I haven't really done. So like a lot of my home network is still based on the 172.2.7 IPv4 addresses, even if everything has an IPv6 address that they can use. I shouldn't be gone again. I'm still here. I didn't lose the internet again. Yeah, so part of this network redesign is it didn't seem to save any of my changes. Yeah, so I mean, every time I connect to a network, I look at like what IP address did I get, and if all I got was one IPv4, I'm like, oh man, this is like cringe. Switch. So you need to be layer 3. There we go. You're going to be layer 3. LTE backup is going to get unused. And it's going to be a second route to the switch. MikroTik hex. I could put the hex here. Or not. Use for DNS. Yeah, so I'm hoping to do an IPv6 upgrade. IPv6 is a big step. IPv6 is now 27 years old. It was rolled out. It was more than 25. It's 1996, wasn't it? IPv6. 98. Okay, I was a little bit off. So yeah, it's almost 25 years old. You're right. Yeah, so 98. I thought it was 96. 25 years. We've had 25 years to transition and nobody's cared. Which is like, there's just so many advantages to doing v6 for everything. So like, we're currently stuck in this world of NAT and double NAT. Like everyone's getting a CGNAT and then they're NATing on their own subnet. And if everyone had IPv4 or IPv6, we could just get rid of NAT entirely. Like the only place I have NAT in the setup with IPv6 is the NAT64 server, which is going back to IPv4. So no more NAT. No more like dumb subnetting. Everything is a 64. It's not complicated. You let devices assign themselves an IP. You don't have to assign them anything. No more need for a DNS server. It's like there's just so many things that are easier about it. It's not hard. It's just different. And if you're used to relying on NAT as your like source of security, that's just a bad way to go, because that's purely a way of getting more out of IPv4, not like a good way of designing networks. Yeah, so like the first wave of IPv4 crisis was to introduce NAT, and then you got CGNAT, which should help with it again. And it's like trying to get Americans to use the metric system. Oh my god! Oh no, you're so right. It has so many advantages, and yet people are dumb. Yeah, I thought about making an IPv6 video. Part of why I did the stream today. There's some good ones out there that I've watched. I guess it just depends on what you're doing. Like if you're a network admin doing this semi-professionally on a small scale or something, like this is not something you should just be ignoring. I've definitely seen videos of some relatively well-respected YouTubers that are just like, we just turn off IPv6 on all of our clients' networks. And it's like, oh, it's not the way to go. Windows 2000. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with Windows 2000. The oldest I've ever had to deal with in the last like 2 years was Windows XP. And XP is not bad to deal with. I mean, it's Windows, but it's not terrible. Yes, disabling IPv6 everywhere seems to be like the thing that like business IT people do, and I have no idea why it's such a prevalent attitude. Because like if you made your entire business network IPv6, you wouldn't have to deal with transition mechanisms if all of your software is internally, like if you're doing Windows 10, Windows 11 clients, you're doing Windows Server, Linux Server, all of that should have, yes, it's not a great attitude to have, that you're just like, we're just going to ignore IPv6 because we don't need to deal with it yet on our end. But like, the only reason we don't have to deal with it yet is because we've been forcing CGNAT so far and things like that. And it's gotten farther. This is going to be my PPSK test. Yeah, so I want to do... Okay, so... Sierra C28 does... Online banking would not work. That's an interesting question. I'm going to see if my online banking works over my NAT64 gateway. I'm not going to do it on this computer that you guys are watching me on. First, let's see if they have a IPv6 address. No, they don't. Of course they don't. Yes, that's a problem with CGNAT. If we were all using IPv6, we wouldn't need to have CGNAT, and this wouldn't be a problem. Okay. Now it looks like my bank does not do public IPv6, at least for their website. Yeah, so with CGNAT, not like with regular NAT, you have a connection that comes in and you're like, okay, TCP destination 80. Now we need to assign a random local port that is the return address of the connection, and you just pick one out of the 16-bit space you have. There's ways to reduce power consumption in CGNAT by not doing logging and stateful, or not doing logging the same way. So on CGNAT, they have to be able to uniquely identify a connection back to a user for legal reasons. So one way to do that is to log every single session and see what address they were terminating from and what port. The other way is to assign each subscriber a block of ports and have that static so that you don't have to log each session. So like port 1000 to 5000 would be first subscriber, etc. And once they run out of ports in their port range, then they just are out of luck. They can't make any more sessions. So that helps with CGNAT power consumption, but it's not something anyone wants to do. And if we didn't have to do NAT, I mean, if we didn't have IPv4, we wouldn't have to do NAT. It'd be fine. Did LTE ever use IPv4? No, it never did. Well, no, I don't think LTE has ever used IPv4, at least internally. So LTE internally is going to use IPv6, and it's going to be well, it's actually just going to use IP. I guess it doesn't care which one. And they're going to be routing traffic amongst their... so all the traffic is encapsulated as it goes through the core network until it gets to the edge. Then it gets decapsulated at some point. Interesting quirk I found too is that T-Mobile uses the Department of Defense's /8 public IPv4 block for CGNAT instead of 100. I found that their addresses are all in the 6 range. When I get an address, it's a CGNAT address, but the private address is all in the .6 range, which belongs to the Department of Defense. And I think it's because they've been doing CGNAT since before that 100.64 range was reserved. Running OpenStack and IPv6. Yeah, so one way you can deal with IPv6 internally is to use the ULA prefixes. And so these are supposed to be globally unique, but not necessarily globally routable. So a ULA prefix starting with FC or FD is supposed to only be able to route other ULAs. They route, but they don't route across the global internet, which starts with a 2. So an address that starts with a 2 would be a public IPv6 address, whereas anything that starts with an F is reserved for something. And so FC and FD are reserved for your local. FF is link local, things like that. So what is the first step for IPv6? Probably turning on IPv6. I mean, you can check if you have an IPv6 address. Let me pull up. Where's my... Yeah, here. Let's pick on the client. What's wrong with you? Eve is dumb sometimes. So like if you, like the bare minimum for IPv6 is to just get traffic to your clients. So like here I have an address that is 2001 DB8 5A5A. This is a, not, well, yeah. So this client has a IPv6 public address, starts with a 2. It can talk to the internet. That's like the first step. So then if any server on the internet has IPv6, it'll probably prefer to connect over IPv6, or has the option to. And then you don't have to change anything about your internal network. You can still use your 192.168 internally, but externally, the 2001 can be used. That's like the first step. So that's like the dual stack approach, where you still maintain both. ULA addresses with SNAT. Oh no, he's using NAT in IPv6. Oh no. I try not to use, I generally don't use NAT in IPv6. The only case that I have used it is when I set up that special network that uses the documentation prefix but works on the internet, so that I can show you guys without everyone seeing my public prefix. Yeah, I get the dual WAN failover. The other way to do dual WAN failover is to have 2 separate routers, each advertising a different priority. And then when one WAN fail, well, you can use NPT with dual WAN failover as well. So if you have 2 routers both providing an IPv6 prefix at a different priority, then the clients will go to whichever one they can. So if your upstream goes down, WAN goes down, so you don't have to have a static prefix. You just have to pass it on to clients. So like in my case, a client could have FD and also so I could set up 3 different routers on my network. They could all be the same router, they could all be OpenSense, or they could be different routers, advertising 3 different prefixes, and then my clients would get an address on all 3 of them. So in this case, I could do the FD, well, I use FD97, but FD69 sounds better. The ULA prefix, and then the Comcast prefix and the T-Mobile prefix. So if Comcast were to go down, I would just tell the router, or ideally the router would just stop advertising that prefix. And because that prefix stops getting advertised, the clients now can't use it. So they have to fall back on T-Mobile because it's a low priority. They're not normally going to use T-Mobile because it's low priority. But when Comcast goes away, suddenly they have to. And then for everything internal to the network, I can use the ULA prefix. So, so for like servers and stuff, I give them the ULA prefix. I don't want them to have access to the outside world. If I want them to have access to the outside world, I can add a dynamic, like an IPv6 auto, in addition to the IPv6 static. And then for my VPN home, so VPN in coming in, I can use the ULA addresses. So no matter which tunnel I'm taking home, within the network, I'm using the ULA. Yeah, so the INET6 FE80. So that means that you have a link local address, which means you can communicate with other computers on your layer 2 network with IPv6. And that should always work. So like in the olden days of IPv6, well still, there was the 169.254 prefix, and if you couldn't get an IPv4 address, it would automatically pick 169.254.something. And in IPv6, you'll always have that FE80 address. And yeah, it is based on your MAC address. So in this case, your MAC address is BA27EB0BF096, which isn't that big of a deal because if you connect to the internet, you're going to use a randomized address anyway, realistically. Yeah, so the question that's been in the chat is how do you deal with like cloud services or assigning IPv6s? But yeah, so privacy extensions, pretty much every like client should be using privacy extensions on their 2000 prefix. I just allow them pretty much all the time. Yeah. Question is high. So by HAD, I mean high availability. Yeah. So I guess another thing you could do if you like, if you have a load balancer, is you could only give the public prefixes to the load balancer and then just use ULAs internally. So like if I was hosting a website, I could put a web server down somewhere and give it the ULA prefix, and then anyone within the network can talk to it, but then the internet can't talk to it. So then I add a load balancer in front of it, and the load balancer gets the 2000 address and also the FT69 address. And then the load balancer can forward on to the back end. So if you wanted to do some, and yes, that is good practice. But the question you're saying is you need NPT or NAT to deal with OpenStack. What you could do instead is give each group the same ULA prefix, which isn't good practice, but if you're trying to keep the same copy of stuff in production development, you could have your production development have the same ULA prefix and let the load balancers route to them. So then the load balancers would be separate. So that's one way you could do that. Or you could keep them entirely separated. Then the only downside there is that because the servers don't have a 2000 address, they can't get out to the internet to do updates, which may or may not be a feature depending on what you're doing. You could always add a update cache or something locally, or just a proxy. Yeah, so yeah, a load balancer is kind of like doing NAT without doing NAT, and it's, I guess, the way you're supposed to do it in IPv6. Either with a load balancer or something. Yeah, that would make sense to do it with a load balancer or like a TLS proxy, where you're doing like TLS termination, things like that. Yeah, doing it with DNS is another good way too. So another advantage of using IPv6 is it forces you to stop memorizing addresses, because I'm sure we've all done it where we're like, I know what address this server is, and this server, and this TV, and this. I know all the addresses, and I remember them. Yes, HA proxy is great. So with IPv6, the addresses are so long, and they change. So you either have to just memorize the ULAs and give everyone random global prefixes, or you have to rely on DNS properly. And then you're more resilient to changes, because like if I have a whole bunch of services running on different servers, and say they're all running on the same server even, I can still give them each separate DNS names. And separate IPv6s too. And then if I want to migrate things around later, I can keep the same DNS names. Yes, Anycast. Anycast is something I have not tried. I've done a lot of other things with IPv6, but not Anycast. Yeah, so what devices do I have that don't do IPv6? So far, I've only found the 2 cameras, and I have a controller that controls a septic pump. And I think everything else I have can do IPv6. Still require firewall rules. Yes. Firewall is the same, IPv4, IPv6. You just have longer addresses. Effectively the same. I mean, there's no more NAT, so there's no more port forwarding. Instead of like port forwarding, you're just opening the port in the firewall, which you would have been doing anyway. You're just not having to translate it anymore. It's just being allowed, which is way nicer. Yeah. So I wonder if you're getting a new prefix delegation so frequently, if you're changing something in the way you ask the ISP, because I have not gotten, I mean, it's very dependent on the ISP if they're going to give you new prefix delegations. Yeah, so is every OS going to get 4 IPv6s? Basically, yeah. So like I have a server here, and it got how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's normal to get at least 3. So the FE80 is your link local address. So in this case, it's FE80, and then it's the 64-bit MAC address. There should be. So this is a address that's always valid and only valid on the local scope. So these are used a lot in IPv6. So basically, anytime you're communicating with a router, with a lot of things, you're going to use the link local address, which starts with FE80. Then, most of the time, you'll get a prefix delegation. So the router, instead of individually handing out addresses to clients, it will say, here is my prefix. Pick your own address as long as you don't overlap. And then clients will tend to generate at least 2. So sometimes you'll have more on the same prefix. So it's not that uncommon for them to generate an address based on their MAC address and then another one that's random. And they'll use the random one and cycle through the random ones periodically for privacy reasons. But they can always take incoming connections in the MAC-based one, so it's consistent. And then if they're in the middle of transitioning their temporary prefix, sometimes they'll have 2 temporary prefixes. Their old one for existing connections and their new one for new connections. Yeah, so stuff will communicate with itself on the FE80 just automatically. So like I have some, it's kind of funny, that school I talked about that has like the giant /16 because their network design is pretty terrible. All the printers just advertise themselves on MDNS. And so I can go in there and plug into any jack on the wall, and suddenly I find like 50 printers show up on my thing, all over IPv6. Like, they disabled IPv6 of the firewall, but that doesn't mean devices aren't still going to communicate with each other. And so then in this case, the /64 means it was assigned via Slack. And then this one, the 128, was assigned by DHCP v6. So it is possible to do address assignment via DHCP, but normally DHCP is not used that way. Normally what you will do is you will use DHCP for prefix delegation, but not for addresses. And you'll use Slack for addresses normally. If you really like the what are they called? DHCP reservations, it's possible to do it that way if you really want to. Android won't support it, but everything else will. So that's how I end up with 4 addresses. But that's just with one router. So if you're also doing ULA addresses, then you have 2 or 3 addresses on each router. So you can quickly add up to like 8 or 9 different addresses in the same interface in IPv6. And it's not a problem. Everything just works fine. Having addresses is good. Yeah, so I was thinking about doing a video where I sat down at the table and got my favorite person's my cat mug with some tea and talked about how the internet's running out of addresses and we need to switch to IPv6. But I did the live stream and maybe I'll do a video about it in the future. Yeah, so this is. So the school actually is quite technical. They have Surface. They give out Surface tablets for every student. So they have something like thousands of devices. And then their elementary school does iPads. So they have, I don't know, across other divisions, probably something like 1,200 student and faculty devices. And the only segregation they have is they have a separate network for students and faculty. So student network has like 1,000 students on it. And the faculty network has all the printers, everything that's not the student network. Or they have the public network, the student network, and the private network, which has all the faculty computers on it, all the printers, everything. It's terrifying. And if you just plug into a jack on the wall, all of them work, and they all work on the private network. It's terrifying. That's not how to do security, but it works for them. So IP address management. Yeah. So for a long time, my IP address management was this. This. So, man, I was basically using the DHCP static mappings as IP address management. So that's how I've done it in the past, and I guess how I still do a lot of it. Basically, I have the /20. The upper half of the network is DHCP, so there's a /21 for DHCP clients, which is a ton of space. But I hate I rely a lot when I'm testing things on the fact that DHCP addresses never have to, we never run out of DHCP addresses. So if I'm testing something new, there's a good chance I won't give anything an address. I'll just let it all find it over DHCP and it'll be good. But for things that I do care about, I would give them a static mapping, even if I didn't set it as a static address. So like a switch. It has a static mapping here, but the switch is configured for static IPv4, not for DHCP. And so I can look at the static mapping table and say, here's all the good stuff I've got. It's here, basically. Some of this stuff is using DHCP, but not all of it. And that's something I'd like to find a replacement for, because I'm not it's not the worst thing in the world. It does give you local DNS automatically. What I found, though, is with DNS 6.4 enabled on Unbound, if I go down here, so I have DNS 6.4 enabled, it won't synthesize Quad A records from static DHCP v4 entries. I don't know why that is, but it just doesn't work. So all of these static entries, if I go to them and ask for Quad A, I get nothing. So I have to do static DHCP v6 entries then, which is, I don't use DHCP v6, so it's not something I would want to do. So there's that. I have been looking at other systems. So I did try What's your IP address? 100 at 69.96. Okay. You 5 or you 4? Yeah, you. So I was trying out Pi-hole and AdGuard Home before you guys came on my stream because I'm not mad at OpenSense. OpenSense I've been happy with, but the one thing I want to figure out is doing IP address management better. Yeah, so DHCPv6 is something that I initially thought I really needed, and I just dealt with Android clients not doing IPv6. But I've concluded that I don't need DHCPv6 anymore. So my Proxmox servers get IPv6 static, and everyone else gets Slack. And my Proxmox servers only get static for the addresses that they need to be static, which is the ULAs. So for the global prefixes, they get Slack also. And then the only reason they need a Slack address is so they can get out to the internet to do updates. But if I was in a more corporate environment, I could set up a update cache or a update proxy, and I wouldn't need to give them a global address at all. ClearOS for network management. I have not looked at ClearOS. Let's see what their website looks like. Someone said I should look at ClearOS. So we're going to pull up their website. Resources. Linux distro with a web UI. I guess I don't particularly care about that. I will look at it later. Yeah. That's not that's IPAM. It is not finding it. Back to what I was saying before, though. So I have local DNS through Unbound in OpenSense, and I love Unbound. It's pretty good. I don't dislike it at all. What I wish was I had a way to do IP address management better. And so I was looking at if I could do, if like Pi-hole, because Pi-hole is something that everyone seems to love for some reason. I don't get the appeal. So I tried setting it up, and I was not terribly pleased. So I came here and I was like, my firewall has like 1 billion addresses, and it told me, no, you can only have one IPv4 and one IPv6 each. So I put in some fake addresses here. If I try... If I put in an address, it's going to tell me you can only have one IPv6 entry. So then I tried AdGuard Home, and it will let me do as many as I want for the same host, which is nice, but I can't edit them, and I don't know why. I just have to delete them and recreate them, which seems odd, but I guess it's not the end of the world. This could be a solution for local DNS. Netbox. IP address management. Okay, we will look at Netbox before the next public demo. Okay, we have blocked JavaScript, as one does. Yeah, so I have DHCP updating DNS as well. And I found that just doesn't work as well on IPv6 because nothing uses DHCP. DHCP is not nearly as admin. I agree. What's a good local DNS management tool? I use OpenSense and it works. I tried Pi-hole because people seem to absolutely love it, and it just does not do what I want, which is more than one IP for the same host. That's like a bare minimum requirement for me. AdGuard Home did that, and it was not hard to set up either. Also, Pi-hole, the install script crashed when I tried to run it on a host that didn't have IPv4. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but I thought that was a sites. Racks. Okay, this seems nice. Not bad. Hi, Pam. Can you do VXLAN too? VLAN's 4. Okay. It can do stuff. It's interesting, none of this example has any IPv6 in it. Okay, that's something. And I used Unbound as well. You know, someone says they use OpenSense with Unbound. I use OpenSense with Unbound as well. But I use it to do DNS over TLS to Quad 9 instead of to Cloudflare. Yeah. I will have to try Netbox in the future. They do DNS too. That's a question. DNS. DNS. Do you do any DNS or do you not do DNS? Yeah, so if this could populate DNS for me, it would be very handy. Does not provide DNS server. Okay. So I need a DNS server to integrate with it. Not the end of the world. Okay. How long have I been going? Well, not even not even 2 hours yet. Okay. So Netbox, we could. Yes, so one downside of OpenSense is it returns queries. It doesn't return a different query depending on what interface it originated from, and it just does not do that. So like in my case, OpenSense, if I query its own hostname, I get 8 responses, 4 IPv4s and 4 IPv6s. And so that's all the different interfaces that it has addresses on. And so it's up to the host to decide that this address I should use instead of that one. And in theory, the host should do that correctly. I would hope. I did some testing before, and it seemed like hosts, if they, at least Linux hosts, if they got a series of IP addresses and one of them was on their own subnet, they would choose the one on their own subnet before they went to the other ones. And it seemed reliable. I didn't try it that hard, but... Layer 2 overlays. VLAN groups. Virtualization, virtual machines. Clusters. Okay. Any other questions about my network setup, I guess? I was looking back at the changes. We're going to make you left aligned. Okay, so custom resources. That does sound handy. Maybe. These would be things I'm going to try to do. So I should try add T-Mobile. What else is on my network to-do list? There. I see. So it's possible that Windows does things differently than everyone else. So my experience with Linux was that Unbound on OpenSense will give out all of the addresses, and then the client, if it gets a big list of addresses and one of those addresses is on the same subnet, then it will just use that directly. Or if none of them are on the subnet, it'll pick a random one. And so maybe Windows just always picks a random one. I don't know. IP asset scanning. No, I haven't done any sort of IP scanning on the network. I guess I could. I unplug and plug stuff in so much. I mean, I just have mountains of stuff that I test, and it's not always a clean experience in the network. But segregating, oh yeah. Segregate lab and LAN. Once we have a separate lab and LAN, then the lab can lab and the LAN can LAN. And yeah. So that'll probably be a whole bunch of videos in the future to do all this stuff. Try NetBox, maybe for a video. Maybe just for myself. Yes, please save. Stop being dumb. I need something that will take NetBox and push it to DNS. And then aside from that, that should be pretty much what I want. Reload all the tabs since we lost power. Okay, so that might be about it for today. We seem to be kind of dropping off on things to talk about. Unless anyone has more IPv6 questions. Ooh, that's a good question. So the way to do it is to use virtual IPs. So what I have done is interfaces this guy. So I have a virtual IP, and then down here under services, RA, you can put more than one advertised route. The other way to do it is to use a separate router for the local prefix, because you can have more than one router on the same network. So if you want to have like a router in a virtual machine or something to do one of the routes, and a router on physical interface to do the internet facing routes, that's another option. So then, yeah, that sounds cool. Proxmox and NetBox. This one. So you can have as many routers on the same like layer 2 domain as you want with IPv6, and it's fine. The clients they have a way of preferring each other. So like if you have let's say, so like if you have a router for global internet and a router for ULAs, then the clients will pick the ULA router for any ULA because a ULA scope is more likely to be found on the ULA router than the global router, and vice versa. If they have an address that starts with a 2, they'll go to the global router. Yeah, so priority low, normal, high, you can define. So you can have two or more routers all providing global access, but in addition, you can have different scopes. So you can have a router providing ULA access and a router providing global access, and they're different scopes. So even at the same priority, the clients will pick one or the other based on scope. And then in the same scope, then you have priority. So that's how you can do things like failover natively in IPv6, as long as the router properly goes down when the internet goes down. So like if Comcast stops working and I keep advertising my Comcast route to my LAN clients, they're still going to keep sending traffic to it because the router still says it's up. But as soon as that router goes down and advertises that it went down, then they'll fall back on their low priority route. So they should. This does seem nice. So it's a Proxmox plugin for NetBox. And we have a DNS plugin. Okay, so there are some plugins that do DNS. This seems to do a lot more like what I want than the Pi-hole did. Pi-hole gets that clickbait though. I don't. Pi-hole didn't seem great to me. Okay, so I have some things to look at now. Netbox. Probably should migrate some other things to IPv6. None of my Proxmox servers are doing IPv6 right now. Probably for bind. Yeah, probably. I can't always. It's possible to run a server as a domain override instead of a host override. So like I could set up a server. Pi-hole only works on Linux. Yeah, so I installed Pi-hole on a Debian machine here, this virtual machine. And first I tried to give it only IPv6 and the installer crashed. So that was not a good sign. So then I gave it IPv4 and it worked. And one of the things I have is I have devices with more than one Ethernet interface. And it wouldn't let me add local DNS overrides to more than one address of the same type. So like Firewall is supposed to have 4 addresses and only lets me add 1. That's not going to work. AdGuard at least did allow me to do that. In OpenSense, I can do if I go to overrides, I can do a domain override. So what I could do is set OpenSense as my domain server for everyone, and then add a domain override for my internal domain, and point that at the server that's doing the internal hosts. Or I could do the other way around and have this one do, because this one does recursive resolving. I could point it the other way. Or if I really wanted ad blocking, I could have the ad blocking one and then point that one at get a more than one DNS server, basically. Core DNS. Read zone data from netbox index. Yeah. Does anyone have a favorite Linux-based router? Because I use OpenSense a lot, and the only thing it won't do right now is NAT64, which I'd really like to be doing. And yeah, so currently it's running in a VM on Eve, which is not a place to run production stuff because Eve is really experimental. And I'm doing it in Joule, which needs a kernel module. I really haven't seen anyone with a good integration for NAT64. Okay, it has now been 2 hours. I think it is about time to finish. Core DNS. Yes, everyone's favorite, Kubernetes. Vios. I did a live stream on Vios like 3 months ago and I broke it. I've heard things about Vios. I did not have a great experience with it when I tried it. That was my experience. So I did 2 live streams back in October where I tried RouterOS and I tried Vios. And RouterOS I picked up pretty quickly, and it worked fine. And Vios, so OpenSense can't do NAT64. That is true. It can't do NAT64. BSDPF can do NAT64, or at least claims to implement it. Then on Linux, there's a kernel module called Joule that can do it as well. But oh yes, hello. Yeah, not a lot of firewall distributions have implemented it. I did try. So that I tried. Yeah, so PF has an implementation of it, but it might not have made it all the way into the releases that OpenSense is using, which I think is currently FreeBSD 13. It will eventually. Yeah, so Joule's a kernel module, but it's not in tree. MikroTik doesn't have support for it, which is unfortunate because I like RouterOS and would love to use RouterOS if I could. Maybe I just need to run on a separate server somewhere, which is always an option to do translation on the server instead of doing it on the router. I guess the other advantage that would give me is that I could do failover for IPv4 clients the same way that I do them for IPv6 clients. What am I trying to accomplish? We spent the entire live stream talking about IPv6 and how it's the future. Yes, FRR. FRR is something I've played with a little bit. I was trying to set up a network on my cluster that was routed. So the clusters would have a bunch of point-to-point links around the cluster, and instead of buying a 2.5 gig switch, I could do 2.5 gig point-to-point links and then route across them. And that worked fine. But then I got a 2.5 gig switch, so don't need to route that anymore. But FRR was not hard to use. I was surprised. Yeah, so the other problem, on the Ceph topic too, the problem I seem to be having with Ceph is that I'm using USB drives that are really slow. So everything I do to try to speed it up ends up being that the drives are just so slow that it doesn't matter that things are being sped up on the network side. So eventually I'll need a new cluster to test with. And I've been thinking that what I really want to do is take these guys and merge them all. So I'd like to go from TrueNAS, Proxmox, the cluster, the Eve server, and the 2.5 gig switch, and move that all into a Ceph cluster, because I have spinning Rust in TrueNAS, I have SSD in TrueNAS, I have SSD in Proxmox by itself, local storage. So my production Proxmox server has its own local SSD, and it backs up to TrueNAS. And then the cluster has Ceph, and I love Ceph, but the cluster is so slow. And so what I'd like, and then Eve also, Eve is a great learning platform. Maybe I'll just keep Eve separate and merge these guys. But I feel like the cluster is, I understand it well enough to move my production stuff to it, but I just need better hardware, because I have half decent hardware for these two, and I can't really build a 3-node cluster out of half decent hardware on 2 nodes. Especially when one of them literally has no I/O at all. Yeah, so if you have CGNAT, so one option you have is to route through like a cloud provider as a point of presence. So I'm not sure what cloud providers give out in terms of IPv6, but you need, if you can get a prefix delegation, you could tunnel that back over through WireGuard to get IPv6 local. Oh, you can do a Hurricane Electric does tunneling as well. So you can get a public IPv6 prefix and then tunnel it over IPv4. And that should give you inbound traffic as well. So you have a public IPv6 space. That means you can do port forwarding, which you don't port forward an IPv6. You just allow through the firewall. But no, Ceph is not known for being fast, but it's known for being very reliable and having good guarantees about data integrity. And the other thing it can do is it can scale. Like, can it ever scale? Yeah, so I could get my own ASN. It's not actually that expensive, and if I had a business of any size, I probably would get my own ASN. Not ASN, sorry. Just a static prefix. In IPv6. They're very cheap to buy static prefixes in IPv6 compared to IPv4. So anyway, another text block here. Long-term goal. We like to move off. Get rid of TrueNAS. Not a huge TrueNAS fan. I use it because I've been using it for a long time. So yeah. So down here in this part of the network, someday I would like to get off TrueNAS because I'm not a huge TrueNAS fan. I know. So people like to do that. I don't have a problem with configuring Samba manually. Most of what I do on TrueNAS is with Samba because Proxmox is virtualization, so I'm not using any containers or VMs in TrueNAS. I'm just doing Samba and NFS. And I can set those up for... I'm doing Scale, and the only reason I'm doing Scale is because it's Linux-based, and I just... not the biggest fan of BSD. So Proxmox is doing my VMs. It's doing ZFS too, so like there's... Yeah, so I have the 3-node Ceph cluster, which is slow. I have the TrueNAS machine, which has hard drives that I use and I can't take down for a long time because it actually has a lot of important data on it. And then I have Proxmox, which runs very important virtual machines as well. Like Home Assistant, if the automated lighting stops automating, it's the end of the world. And the Proxmox node is a tiny, tiny little mini PC that has no expansion basically at all, other than the NVMe and SSD, one of each. And then TrueNAS is limited by the ITX board I have. It's mini ITX. It has one PCIe slot, which is used for my 10 gig card, and then 4 SATA, which I need a separate boot drive because TrueNAS won't let me use my boot drive for booting, or for ZFS. So I've wasted a SATA port on my boot drive, and then I've got 3 SATA drives. Houston Command Center. I have not tried Houston Command Center. I've been thinking about doing a video where I run Houston Command Center in a LXC container for Samba. So we use the Proxmox's underlying ZFS pool and then mount a second drive into the container for Samba, and then use Houston to manage Samba. And I feel like that would be kind of a lot of setup versus just typing the commands in just for Samba. But I guess it depends on how much Samba you're doing. How much Sambaing. Yeah, I have looked at Houston. I haven't learned it enough to do a video on it, but I think it's definitely a good project. I guess it feels weird running 2 different ZFS managers on the same system, like installing it on Proxmox so the host can manage Samba. So what I would really like, I think, is to have a cluster of nodes, each of them having like 1 or 2 spinning drives and like an NVMe or 2, and some amount of virtualization on each of them. They don't have to be that powerful, but they need to be like powerful enough. And then I could add graphics cards to the servers so that they could do remote rendering, even if just one of the servers has a render server that doesn't have to be high availability. And then within that, I could create a LXC container or a VM to run CephFS client and bridge that to Samba. And then that would be high availability. So Proxmox would migrate it around the cluster as things came on and off. And then I would have Samba, I would have Ceph. I probably would just end up installing the CephFS client directly on my workstation because the workstation is what does the bulk of the data to TrueNAS because it's all video files that are gigantic. How big are they? It's like that meme with the, it's so big. Yeah. Oh, it's not as bad as I thought. 300 gigs. That's where I'm at with video data. So all the data from the YouTube channel is so far 300 gigs. Yes. So mounted disk in a VM would do that, but not if the VM does the mount itself. So, well, two different things. So if I have a VM, I could mount the Ceph cluster in the VM itself. So the VM is doing the networking to Ceph directly, not relying on Proxmox's Ceph client. So then I could do CephFS directly in the VM and then forward that to Samba. The other option is to run it in LXC, and then I lose the ability to do a kernel mount, which is fine. And Samba has a way to mount Ceph directly as well, I think. Haven't played with it a ton. So another, I guess, known problem is that doing... Apparently, CephFS kernel mounts aren't reliable when you're running OSDs on the same system. It's just in the documentation. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what I've read. So that is another thing to play with. Yes, I would like to move to a Ceph cluster. What I really want are probably like... So I have that little tiny TerraMaster NAS that I got from TerraMaster, and what I'd really like are like 3 of their rack mount units, or like maybe 1 of their rack mount units plus 2 servers I build myself or something. I'm not sure entirely. I don't really want to build a... I could build more servers myself. I know that costs a lot of money. You only have so much money to spend on servers. What I really like would be for like a 3-node cluster with each node to have like 2 or 3 spinning drives. I guess I could just do more nodes and have each node have like 1 spinning drive, 1 SATA, 1 NVMe. Or I could do just 1 spinning drive and 1 NVMe, because SATA and NVMe are not that different in price now. Yeah, I eventually will write a guide on it, but it'll probably be a little while. Because I'm still learning CephFS myself, and so to learn it well enough to be able to share it means I have to be decently good at it. Not like perfect at it, but I have to know enough to know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so the other option is to run in a VM and then do a kernel mount in the VM and then share that. I know 45 Drives usually recommends using redundant Ceph gateways, but I think they're running high availability at the Samba level, whereas I would run high availability at the Proxmox level, and so it would move around the gateway as needed. Yeah. Add render server. Been thinking about... Yeah, should I do building nodes? Does anyone like watching PC building videos and watch me build a cluster of rack mount nodes? It's not something I really want to do, but I mean, I do want to do it, but I don't want to at the same time. Might be fun. Okay, so I think I've said this a couple times now in the past like half hour. I think it's about time for me to be done now. I've been here for 2 hours and 15 minutes. So, yeah, more videos coming this week, hopefully. Microserver Gen 10. I do have an HP Microserver Gen 8 that I use a lot for testing and videos. It seems to have problems with PCIe pass-through. The Microserver Gen 8. It's not, it's this whatever I'm testing block here. You just add another one over here, the Microserver Gen 8. Yeah, so I don't like old rack mount servers. I mean, I like them, but they use a lot of power. I don't want to be using all that power. The microserver uses a ton of power compared to the TerraMaster that I just recently tested. And it doesn't really do that much more for that amount of power. Yeah, the Gen 8 is really not loud, the microserver. It's a little cube. It's, I mean, when it powers on, the fans like roar, but then it comes back down and it's not really running the fans much at all. I left it in my bedroom for like 3 weeks and running and it was fine. Yeah, Xeons use power. So a lot of my servers are based on like consumer motherboards and stuff. And two of them, so the Proxmox and the EVE-NG, are both based on Ryzen APUs. So I guess now that every Ryzen chip has onboard graphics, that could be an option for me. I wanted to spend a bunch of money on brand new CPUs. Could also look on eBay and see how used like Ryzen 1600s are going. eBay. Is everyone upgrading their Ryzen now? 1600. Price. $20. $30. Not bad. Yeah, so I get some of those, some AM early gen Ryzens. That'd be an option. So many choices. Also, building 1U servers is a huge pain. 2U servers are way easier to build. Yeah, so like for me, the dividing line is DDR4. If it's DDR3, it's probably going to be too inefficient. And if it's new enough to be DDR4, it's probably worth using. But at the same time, if it's DDR4, it's probably not getting like thrown out. It's probably still useful. So it has a decent price attached to it. Yeah, so someone said 2016. I relatively agree with that. DDR4 is like my cutoff. I won't really go DDR3 unless it's really cheap. Like the microserver was given to me. The TrueNAS server I built in like 2018, so DDR3 was still new back then, or newish. DDR4 was. The cluster runs on thin clients that cost $33 each. So yeah, all options. Okay, now for real I'm going to sign out, because I've been talking about ending for a long time. So yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. I had a good time. Got almost 500 viewers so far, 25 concurrent. That's pretty good. I'm happy to chat with all of you guys, as always. I have more videos coming for this next week. Well, one video coming this week, one video coming next week. And I guess you'll see them on Thursday. Yeah. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye. End stream.